Buenas tardes a todos y muy bienvenidos en Casa Árabe.
Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you all in Casa Árabe. As you know, our main objective is to promote the relationships between Spain and the Arab world, and we also want to try and highlight and showcase the challenges that the Arab world and the relationships with the Arab world nowadays mean for us. Today we are going to talk about something that is really very important right now. Europe is or used to be a more or less homogeneous entity, and since the 60s, 70s, this has changed in some countries due to the arrival of immigrants basically from the colonies in those first times. This affected several European countries, and in these last years this has now become a very general phenomenon. The influx of immigrants is now basically an influx of Islam immigrants. And due to this phenomenon, Europe has stopped being a culturally homogeneous continent. Nowadays we have different communities, Islamic communities that have to be integrated. So now the challenge is to find a legal framework that will help us to create a situation in which we all feel comfortable, both the new arrivals and the European citizens. And this means that the Islamic communities have to respect the rules that govern our European societies, which very often are different, very different from the rules they were used to in their countries of origin. And this is what we are going to talk about. We are here. We have our guests, José Antonio Nieto, and Mr. Wilhelm Hofmeister, the director of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and Mr. Ismail Tipi from the Parliament of Hessen, and he is a specialist for integration on behalf of his party, the Christian Democratic Union. They also are being accompanied by members of the German embassy, and for a reason, because Germany is the country that in these last times has accepted the largest number of immigrants on top of a very important Turkish community that already lives among the German citizens. So Germany has become a country that is a real model, a real role model for other countries. I can certify that because I have lived in Hamburg for 5 years, and it was really admirable to watch how the German society accepted these new immigrants with real feeling and really trying to get to know them. So I hope this will be interesting for you all, and I now pass on the floor to Mr. Hofmeister. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Pedro Gerialde. Thank you, Mr. Tipi, a member of Parliament of the German Hessen Parliament. And ladies and gentlemen, it is for me a real pleasure to be able to welcome you here at the beginning of this meeting about the integration of Islam in Europe. It has been a pleasure to prepare this meeting together with Casa Árabe. We have cooperated quite often in recent times. The integration is a permanent challenge in the history of humanity. There have always been people who have had to leave their countries of origin and had to integrate in the places that received them. So integration is hardly a new phenomenon. But in our days, the numbers of immigrants have grown dramatically in the same way as the world population has grown. 2015 is a year where 240 million people were considered to be immigrants. In the year 2010, it were only 170 million. So in very few years, the increase has been about 70 million more people that had to leave their homes. The reasons were manifold. Initially, there's of course economic migration, but also, of course, the wars, climate change, more mobility, and many other reasons. A third of these migrants live in Europe, 80 million more or less. 2 alone in Germany, in Spain about 6 million of immigrants. So both our countries are countries that receive large numbers of these migrants. Approximately 20 million among these migrants are considered refugees. Most of them nowadays live in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Pakistan, not so many in continental Europe. It is true that both for the migrants as well as for the receiving countries, the number of migrants in itself is a problem with regard to where to place them. In Germany, well, as I said, 2 million of migrants, and in reality the problem is not so important if we consider a total population of 80 million. During the last years, the increase of migrants from culturally different backgrounds, on the other hand, has become a problem for the arrival countries, particularly in the European countries. There was more and more reticence and even open rejection with regard to Islamic migrants. Unfortunately, I believe at least, this rejection is actually due to two misunderstandings. On the one hand side, the Islamic migrants arrive at a point in time when Islam is invariably associated to the threat of terrorism. It is when, on the other hand, that is not true. But regrettably, these two phenomena take place parallel in time, at the same time. So this Islamic fundamentalism and the terrorism based on it, and on the other hand, this massive arrival of people who fled from war zones, but come from Islamic countries, and some countries with a very extreme form of Islam. And this is something that we'll no doubt will talk about. And the other reason has to do with our own societies. There is an increasing number of people in our own societies who feel left out, marginalized, and they now blame the migrants for this situation that they find themselves in. and even more so, they projected towards those of the migrants who are clearly different from them. In Germany, what is interesting is that the region which has accepted the smallest number of migrants, really next to no migrants, that would precisely be the region where the party, where the xenophobic right-wing party has achieved the best results. It's paradoxical because this is particularly a region where there is absolutely no threat coming from migrants. But on the other hand, there is another challenge, a challenge for those who arrive in our countries, who arrive to our European cities. They find a democratic society with a culture and freedoms that are important achievements for us. And that is the reason why we expect from those who arrive that they respect these rights that we consider fundamental for us. And this is the challenge for the migrants, the challenge to accept the local rules and ways of life, particularly with regard to the freedoms and the respect towards the individual persons, human rights, and so on. Other things are more easily accepted, like different food and so on, but these freedoms and civil rights are very important for our societies and have to be borne in mind in this process of integration. So the migrants also are asked to make big efforts adapting to the very different reality they now find themselves in our communities, in our municipalities, our society. So from this point of view, both sides have to accept that they have to make efforts. And here in Europe, we have to adapt to migrants who come from very different cultural backgrounds. It was much easier, for example, for Spain to accept the Latin American immigrants with a very similar culture to their own. But in Germany and many other European countries, the immigration from these other cultures is more difficult. There is no doubt about it, even though we are the dominant culture here. So we have to learn from this exchange of experiences, and this is the reason why we are so thankful to Casa Árabe, which has made this encounter here possible and this dialogue. And we also thank the speakers who come from different countries of Europe and from Spain, and who will present their experiences, their cases, and we trust that we will have a very fertile dialogue, and hopefully we'll be able to learn from each other. Thank you very much.
Ja, vielen herzlichen Dank. Ich darf das in Deutsch machen. Ich glaube, das wird auch übersetzt. Sehr geehrter Herr Staatssekretär, sehr geehrter Herr Direktor Martin Savial und sehr geehrter Herr Direktor Hoffmeister, vielen herzlichen Dank für die Einladung. Ich bin sehr gerne nach Madrid gekommen, weil ich glaube, dass gerade das Thema Ich glaube, gerade das Thema der Migranten, besonders mit dem muslimischen Glaubensrichtung, ist sehr wichtig, weil ich selber auch einen muslimischen Glauben habe und auch gehöre zur ersten Generation der Gastarbeiterkinder. Ich komme ursprünglich aus der Türkei. Mein Vater kam 1968, meine Mutter 1969 nach Deutschland und 1974 bin ich dann nach Deutschland gezogen und habe dort meine Schulabitur und aber auch mein Studium gemacht. Das heißt, ich habe die fast halbe Jahrhundert Migrationsgeschichte auf der eigenen Haut erlebt. Deutschland hat eigentlich eine der höchst entwickelten Willkommenskulturen, meine Damen und Herren. Und diesbezüglich haben wir auch in Deutschland etwa 18,7 Millionen, rund 19 Millionen Menschen mit Migrationshintergrund. Und davon etwa 5 Millionen Menschen, die muslimischen Glaubens haben. Das ist eine hohe Zahl, aber in Deutschland wird seit ein halbes Jahrhundert, seit mehr als 50 Jahren, eine sehr gute Integrationsarbeit betrieben. Man ist bemüht, den Migranten in die Alltag reinzulegen, schulischen Ausbildung zu geben und natürlich auch den beruflichen Ausbildung. In Deutschland kann eigentlich jeder, auch die Migranten, alles erreichen, wenn sie sich das wünschen. Nämlich auch ich besitze einen Namen, der nicht unbedingt deutsch klingt, aber ich konnte und durfte auch in Deutschland einen Maschinenbau studieren. Aber ich habe als 30 Jahre lang als Journalist gearbeitet bis zu meinem Landtagsmandat und seit 7 Jahren bin ich Abgeordneter der CDU-Fraktion im russischen Parlament. Das heißt, wenn einer in Deutschland will, wenn er bereit ist zu arbeiten, wenn er bereit ist, Leistungen zu bringen, wenn man aber auch bereit ist, Verantwortung zu übernehmen, stehen in Deutschland für alle Menschen, Einheimischen, sowohl aber auch den Migranten, alle Türen und Toren offen. Das heißt, die meisten Muslime und aber auch die allermeisten Migranten in Deutschland fühlen sich wohl, das zeigen auch die Statistiken. Besonders die muslimischen Migranten in Deutschland haben bei einer letzten Untersuchung der Demografen angegeben, dass sie in ihrer Freizeit, 84% davon, dass sie ihre Freizeit mit Nicht-Muslimen, also mit den Einheimischen und das ist eine gute Sache. In Hessen sagen wir zum Beispiel, wo wir eigentlich viel in die Integrationsarbeit leisten, finanziell, aber auch mit viel Arbeitskraft, nämlich wir versuchen den Menschen die Sprache beizubringen. Die Sprache ist A und O für die gute gelungene Integration. Sprache ist vielleicht nicht alles, aber ohne die Sprache geht es nicht. Deswegen investiert das Land Hessen und aber auch das Bundesrepublik Deutschland sehr viel Geld in die Ausbildung der Sprache der Migranten, die zu uns kommen. Besonders in den letzten 2 Jahren, 2015 und 2016, haben Sie alle miterlebt, hat Deutschland etwa 2 Millionen Menschen Flüchtlinge aufgenommen und auch da ist die Bereitschaft sehr groß, diesen Menschen die deutsche Sprache beizubringen, sie im Alltag überhaupt einleben zu lassen. Es passiert sehr viel Energie der ehrenamtlichen Menschen in Deutschland. Dafür bin ich sehr dankbar. Meine Damen und Herren, man sagt immer, Sprache ist eigentlich wichtig für die Integration. Das ist aber nur ein symbolischer Schlüssel für uns. Wenn wir in einem Land integrieren wollen und durch eine Tür reingehen wollen, reicht für mich dieser symbolische Schlüssel nicht. Für mich ist eigentlich immer wichtig bei der Integrationsarbeit, ich sage es immer, eine magische Dreieck. Ich brauche einen Schlüssel für die Sprache, aber ich brauche einen zweiten Schlüssel der Qualifikation. Das ist für mich die schulische und aber auch die berufliche Qualifikation. Qualifikation in Form von Führerschein, Internetkenntnisse und so weiter. Ich habe aber 2 Schlüssel in der Hand. Kann es sein, dass ich den Tür trotzdem nicht aufmachen kann, weil vielleicht noch ein Riegel hinter der Tür ist als Sicherheit, wie ich es ja wie viele wahrscheinlich auch zu Hause haben. Und da ist für mich der dritte Schlüssel sehr wichtig, nämlich die Teilhabe der Gesellschaft. Das heißt, dass man sich aktiv in der Gesellschaft bringt. Noch langsamer. Okay. Ja, meine Damen und Herren, wenn man diese 3 Schlüssel hat, Sprache, Qualifikation und Teilhabe in der Gesellschaft, Ehrenamt und Verantwortung übernehmen, dann kann es eigentlich für jeden Menschen, der es will, in Deutschland die Integration ermöglichen und auch gelingen. Ich kann in meiner Person sagen, dass wir eigentlich in Deutschland eine der besten Integrationsarbeit vielleicht so in ganz Europa machen. Das zeigt die Anzahl der Menschen, die zu uns kommen und kommen wollen und die Menschen, die sich auch dort wohlfühlen und dort auch gerne leben. Das ist natürlich eine Seite der Medaille, meine Damen und Herren. Die Frage, wie werden die Muslime in Deutschland integriert, diese Frage stellt sich eigentlich für mich nicht, weil wir keinen Unterschied machen zwischen Einheimischen, keinen Unterschied zwischen den Migranten, Muslime oder Nicht-Muslime. weil wir auch nicht wollen, dass wir die
because we
Menschen
don't make a
positiv
difference
diskriminieren.
between Muslim
Für mich als
migrants and
Integrationspolitiker ist
non-Muslim
es wichtig,
migrants.
dass wir
We
eine
don't
Politik für die
discriminate in
Menschen
any
machen.
way. So we don't
Das heißt, ich
discriminate either
sage immer,
positively or
was für
negatively.
Peter gut ist,
As a politician
kann auch
specialized
für
in
den Ahmed
integration,
oder Ali
what
gut
is
sein.
important for me
Was
is
aber
to
für
develop
Elisabeth
policies
schlecht ist,
that
ist
help
auch für Aisha
people.
schlecht. Deswegen müssen wir
What is
versuchen, eine
good for
Politik zu machen,
Ahmed is also
die
good
für
for
die Menschen sind.
Elizabeth and the other way
Ich
around.
kann natürlich noch sehr viel über die
The
gelungene
idea is to
Integration in
develop
Deutschland
policies
erzählen.
that
Es gibt aber
help
auch
people.
das ist eine
I can
Seite der
talk a
Medaille
lot
und es gibt eine
about the
andere
achievements
Seite.
regarding integration in
Nämlich
Germany,
die
but I
meisten
must
Muslime in Deutschland,
accept that
etwa
there is
5
another
Millionen
side of the
Menschen,
same story,
die
and
haben
that
die
is that
Möglichkeit,
most of the
ihre
Muslims
Religion
in
frei
Germany,
zu
that is
leben. Wir haben
approximately
eine
5 million people,
Religionsfreiheit.
have the
Wir haben
possibility
etwa
to follow
2000
their
Moscheen in
creed
Deutschland.
with freedom. We
Das
have a freedom
Problem
of
ist
creed.
eigentlich
There are 200
nicht die
mosques in
Muslime,
Germany.
nicht der
The
Koran,
problem
nicht der Islam
is
oder die
not the
Moscheen.
Muslims, it's
Für
not
mich
the
als
Islam,
Muslim
it's
und auch
not the
als
Quran,
Migrant, der aus
it's
der
not the
Türkei nach
mosques.
Deutschland
For
eingewandert
me,
ist,
as a
wichtig,
Muslim
was passiert
and as an
eigentlich in
immigrant
den
from
Moscheen
Turkey,
und den Moscheen herum.
what is
Das ist für mich
important
die
is what
Kernfrage, meine Damen und
happens
Herren. Und in
inside the
Deutschland sind
mosques,
es leider
around the
einige
mosques.
Muslime,
And
die ein Problem mit
unfortunately,
unserer
in
Demokratie
Germany,
und Rechtsstaat, mit
there
unseren
are
westlichen
some
Werten haben.
Muslims that
Und diese Zahl
have
ist leider
some
in den
issues
letzten
with our
Jahren
values,
nicht
with our
wenig
Western
geworden.
values. And the
Ich habe ja
number
vorhin gesagt, ich
of
habe
people
zwar Maschinenbau
having these
studiert,
problems
aber ich
with
habe 30
the
Jahre in der
Western values
Journalistik
has
gearbeitet
increased in the recent
und seit
years.
84,
I said at the beginning that I
1984
studied
beobachte
engineering,
ich
but I
die
also worked as a
radikal-islamistische
journalist
Tendenzen
for
in
30
Deutschland.
years.
Und
And
meine
since
erste Warnung über
1980,
die
I have been
Fundamentalismus und Dschihadismus in Deutschland
monitoring the
habe ich in
trends to
1984
radicalization
geschrieben.
in Germany. And the
Und
first
unter der Deckmantel der Religionsfreiheit,
awareness,
meine Damen und
the
Herren, hat man
first
in
alerts, I
Deutschland,
published
leider
them
auch
in
in Europa viel falsch gemacht.
1984.
Man hat
Because
die
under the
Muslime
freedom of
willkommen
religion, we
geheißen,
have
aber die Gefahr
approach. We have
in
made a lot of
diesen
mistakes in
Gesellschaft,
Europe.
eine kleine
We
Gruppe,
have
nämlich die
welcomed
der
Muslims
Radikal-Islamisten, Fundamentalisten,
with our
Salafisten
arms
nicht erkannt.
opened, but we have
Man hat sie
realized
ignoriert
that
oder diese
we
Gefahr
didn't
und
realize
Bedrohung
that
nicht wahrhaben wollen.
amongst these Muslims
Und
there are some
deswegen
small
versucht
radical
Deutschland,
groups, and
auch
we didn't
mein
realize
Bundesland
this at the
Hessen,
time.
mit viel
And that
Kraft,
is
mit
why
viel Arbeit und auch viel
Germany
Geld
and the
gegen diese
federal state
radikal-islamistische
of Hesse,
Tendenzen
where I
vorzugehen.
live, we
Meine
are
Damen und Herren, warum sage ich
fighting
das?
very
In
strongly
Deutschland
against
sind
these
offiziellen
radical
Zahlen nach
communities.
etwa 30.000 Menschen, die eine salafistische, wahhabitische,
In
also eine
Germany, according
radikal-islamistische
to official
Tendenz haben.
figures,
Das ist richtig,
there are
aber
about
nach meinen Erkenntnissen
30,000
und Recherchen
radical
nicht mehr
Salafists.
aktuell. In Deutschland leben nach
But
meinem
this
Wissen
figure,
und
according to
Information
my own
etwa
research,
mehr als
is
300.000
not
Menschen, die dem
real.
radikal-islamistischen
The real
Salafismus
figure
nahestehen und
is
zu dieser
actually
Gesinnung
closer to
Sympathie empfinden. Das ist ganz
300,000
einfach. Können Sie jeder
than
Einzelne
30,000.
hier, der sitzen,
At least these
nachverfolgen,
are
wenn Sie Facebook
followers
gehen
of radical
Sie
Islam.
in bekannte
And this
Namen
is
in
easy
Deutschland,
to
diese
observe
Hassprediger, wie ich sie
simply
nenne,
by
Georg Vogel, Sven Lau,
going to
Abu Wala.
Facebook.
Allein 3
Following
große Namen der
the names
Salafisten
of
in
the
Deutschland
hate
bringen auf ihre
preachers.
Facebook-Seiten
There are
etwa
big
350.000
known
Gefällt-mir-Klicks.
names, and if you
Und das
count
ist
the
eine große
followers of
Bedrohung
these
und Gefahr,
preachers,
denn unter
they
diesen
are
Menschen
more than
ist die Schläfer
300,000.
oder diese
And that
Gruppe
there is
der
where
Aktivisten, die
where
auch
we can
bereit sind,
detect the
Gewalt
danger,
auszuüben,
because
für
there
ihren
is where we
Dschihad
have
und für
the
ihren
sleepers,
Scharia
the
glauben,
activists
bestimmt
that
nicht
could
unter
potentially
500 bis
radicalize
600
and
Menschen,
that
die täglich
can
vielleicht darauf warten, durch einen
organize
Knopfdruck
attacks,
irgendwo in
bombings,
Deutschland oder in Europa einen
and
Anschlag
there are
ausüben.
about
Gerade
500,
Spanien
600
ist ja,
people
meine
that are
Damen und
just
Herren,
waiting
auch
for
von
their
dieser
opportunity
Bedrohung
to
betroffen.
commit
2004
an
war das
attack, a
hier in
terrorist
Madrid,
attack.
wo wir
In
uns
fact,
hier gerade
Spain was
befinden.
under
Über
threat
190,
in
194
2004
Menschen sind
here,
durch
right here in Madrid,
radikal-islamistischen Terror gestorben.
190
Es passiert, es vergeht fast
people
keine Tag,
died after
wo
the
irgendwo
Atocha
in
bombing.
dieser Welt diese IS-Terroristen, diese
Now,
Menschen- und
pretty much every
Demokratiefeinde,
day,
diese Verbrecherstaat der IS nicht zuschlagen.
there
Und
is
deswegen finde ich es gut, meine Damen und Herren, dass
pretty much every
gerade
day ISIS or any
Spanien
other
auch seine
terrorist
Polizei
create pain and
auf etwa
victims
3000
somewhere in the
erhöht
world,
hat.
and that is
Und wir
why
bemühen uns
I
auch in
think it is
Deutschland,
important
dass diese
that
Anzahl
Spain
der
has increased
Polizisten,
its police
Anzahl
force
der
in order to
Staatsanwälte
fight
und Richter und auch
terrorism.
der Geheimdienst, die sich für Dschihad und für
Also in
Fundamentalismus
Germany, we're
beschäftigen,
trying to
erhöht wird.
strengthen
Meine Damen und Herren, ich habe vor
the
etwa
police
7 Jahren
forces
im
to
Hessischen
fight
Landtag eine
against
Rede gehalten
jihadism.
und davor gewarnt. Vor
7
den
years ago, I
radikal-islamistischen
gave a speech
Tendenzen.
in the regional
Ich habe
parliament of
gesagt, wenn wir
Hesse,
nicht handeln,
warning about
dann
these
werden in
radical
Zukunft
trends.
viele
I
Mütter
said
und
at the
Väter um
time
ihre Kinder weinen.
that if we don't
Viele
act,
meiner
if we don't
Kollegen haben
take
das nicht
action, in the
verstanden.
future there will be a lot of
Aber heute
parents
weinen
that would cry
allein
for
in
the death of
Deutschland
their
mehr als
children.
200 Väter und
At the
Mütter
time, no one
ihre
understood
Kinder, die
me,
bei dieser
but nowadays there are
gestorben
over
sind.
200
Etwa
parents that have lost
1200
their
deutsche
children in the
Jugendliche,
hands of the ISIS.
Bio-Deutsche, befinden sich in Syrien in diesem sogenannten German
There are
Camp.
thousands of
Diese
German
Menschen, die
youngsters
dort
that are
sind,
now in
die
Syria
werden
in
in
the
den
training camps.
Radikal-Islamismus trainiert für Dschihad
And these
und für
youngsters
die
are being
Scharia-Gesinnung.
trained for
Und davon
on
sind
the
etwa
jihad,
32%
and
weibliche Jugendliche, meine Damen und
they
Herren.
adhere to the
Ich
Sharia
möchte das nicht ausrollen.
legislation,
Die
and
Gefahr
a
der
big
Terrorismus
percentage
ist
of
Ihnen
these
bekannt.
people
Aber
are
im Großen
actually
und Ganzen
women.
kann ich sagen, dass wir in Deutschland eine sehr gute
You know this
Zusammenarbeit
data, I don't
haben,
have to go
weil
into
wir
detail,
denken,
but
dass
in
wir
general I can say
gemeinsam
that
mit
in
Menschen,
Germany now
gemeinsam
there is
mit
a lot of
Migranten
awareness on
und
this.
auch
We
Muslime in
cooperate
diesem Land
because we believe it is the
zusammenarbeiten
only
müssen. Wir versuchen
opportunity to
dort die
stop
Ehrenamt
these
unter den
trends.
Menschen zu
If we
fördern,
want to stop it,
indem
we
wir
want to
sie in
cooperate
unseren
with the
Vereinen, sei
migrants.
es Sport, sei es
We want to
Musik
get
oder auch kulturelle
volunteers
Vereine
amongst them. We
zu
want to
engagieren.
see
Und
people
durch
who
viele
integrate into
Ehrenamtler
our
in
civil
Deutschland
society, into
versuchen
our
wir diese
associations, our
Integration, die
clubs.
uns noch in den
And
nächsten Jahren viel beschäftigen
with
wird,
this
zu kontrollieren.
integration,
Meine Damen und Herren, Deutschland
we
und
believe that we
Europa
will
haben
manage to
3 große
control
Herausforderungen für
these
Zukunft.
radicalization
Wir sind eine
trends.
Gesellschaft, der
Germany
immer
and
älter
Europe are
wird.
facing three
Wir
big
sind eine
challenges.
Gesellschaft, der
We
immer
are a
weniger wird.
society
Wir
that
sind
is
aber auch eine
aging.
Gesellschaft, der immer
We
bunter
are
wird.
a society
Und deswegen müssen wir
where we
versuchen,
have less and
die
less children,
Zuwanderung in unseren
but
Ländern,
we are
sei es in
also a
Spanien
more and
oder
more
in Deutschland,
diverse
in Europa,
society. And that is why
kontrollieren.
immigration in our
Und ich,
countries
trotz
should
jemand, der selbst
be,
ein Migrant in
should
Deutschland
be
ist,
under
sage ich,
certain control.
damit wir in Zukunft in
And I
Frieden
say that I
leben,
come from a
damit wir in
migrant
Zukunft
family,
auch
but I believe that in
unsere
order to continue
Heimat
living in peace,
in der
we
Form
have,
leben und
and if
genießen
we
können,
want to
wie Sie jetzt
continue
kennen,
living in
brauchen wir ein kontrollierter
in a
und eine
country that is more or less
bedarfsorientierter
as we
Zuwanderung.
know it today,
Deswegen müssen wir auch gucken, wie die Flüchtlingswelle in Zukunft sich
need
entwickelt.
migration
Und
to
ich habe
be
eins
under
in meinem
certain
Leben
control.
gelernt, wir dürfen nicht einfach alle Türen und Toren öffnen, weil ich
I have
weiß,
learned
wenn man
something
zu
in my
allen Seiten
life,
offen ist,
and
da
that
ist
is
man
that
auch
it
nicht
is
ganz
not
dicht,
possible
meine
to
Damen und
open
Herren.
all the
Und
doors
deswegen denke
without
ich, wir müssen
care,
kontrollieren und schauen,
because we have
wo
seen
und
what
wie wir
happens
die
if we do
Zuwanderung
that.
gestalten
So we
können.
need a certain degree
Ansonsten
of
werden
control.
wir eine
And
Herausforderung,
we
ein
also
Problem haben, den wir vielleicht in
must
Zukunft nicht mehr
guide
so
this
kontrollieren können.
migration, and we
Vielleicht
must
so viel
guide the
von meiner
development of
Seite aus. Ich
migration.
wünsche Ihnen alles
If we
Gute und noch
don't
gute
want to find
Ergebnisse bei
ourselves
dieser
in a country
Konferenz.
that is
Wenn
very
Sie
different
Fragen
from
haben,
what
würde
we
ich Sie
know.
natürlich gerne
And this is it
beantworten.
from
Vielen
me. I
herzlichen Dank.
conclude here. I hope this conference is very interesting for everyone, and if there are questions, I'll be very happy to answer.
Vielen Dank, Herr Pipi. A continuación tiene la palabra el secretario de Estado de Interior, don José Antonio Nieto Ballesteros. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, director. Muchas gracias a la Casa Árabe por invitarme.
Thank you very much, Director. Thank you very much to Casa Árabe for allowing us to address important discussions like this one, like the one we're addressing, the integration of Muslims in Europe, talking about that reality that today is part of our daily routine, the phenomenon of immigration and the integration of other people coming to live with us here. Those are important topics today. Thank you very much, Mr. Hofmeister. Thank you very much to the director. Thank you very much to the Adenauer Foundation. You've dedicated a lot of time to build the Europe that we have today. Now we have to dedicate the same effort to maintain that society. Unfortunately, the society is not always aware of its own successes, and sometimes if there are no organizations like Adenauer Foundation that opened people's eyes so that we can realize our environment, we risk spoiling and destroying everything that has contributed to the peace and the harmony in the current Europe.
Thank you also very much to Mr. Tipi. As a representation of the political debate in Germany around immigration, around integration, and also because of your particular personal experience, you can contribute to a more full debate so that we can approach this issue from different perspectives. I would like to tackle this topic from the Spanish perspective, more specifically from the one of my ministry, the Ministry of Interior, which is a little bit more related to the control than integration, which would be, and the integration is probably more related to the Ministry of Employment and the Ministry of Social Affairs. And they actually do a lot of work in that field. And cooperation, obviously, with the Ministry of Interior and other ministries that know that we must make an effort if we want that integration and that peaceful living together becomes a reality. But we also have the absolute certainty that the order, the compliance with the law is absolutely crucial so that we can all live together and so that the migration flow works. So what are the foundations of those criteria? Well, we must have a very good control of our borders. We must fight against irregular immigration, and we must be able to manage in a right way the asylum policies. In the case of the asylum policies, it is a responsibility of the Ministry of Interior, and that's what we're working on particularly. I'd like to share with you some figures. I think it is always good to address immigration in an objective way, and data are the most objective elements that we can use to work on this. So when we become objective, we start realizing how a problem is generated, a problem around immigration, and we also start to understand the use that some people do of immigration. So some data from the 15th of November 2017. What we see in those figures is a very important, a very high increase of the migratory pressure in Spain. Until the 15th of November this year, there has been a total of 2,913 irregular entries in our country, and that's 94% more than than last year at the same date. The entries through the land in Ceuta, Melilla, the increase is only 15% over last year, so not a lot, but we have noticed a clear increase, and a worrying increase is in the arrivals through the sea, particularly through the strait. And 17,400 people have entered. That is an over 100% increase over last year. And the situation is different. What at the beginning, what time ago was an issue, that is the entry into the country through the Canaries, that is actually developing very well. There's been a decrease of 55% in that path to enter the country through the Canary Islands. There's also been an increase in certain nationalities. 4,194 of those people were Moroccans. That is an increase of 580% over 2016. And there's also been a very big increase of people from Algeria that have entered Spain. We can see that the post-Arab Spring in certain places, the closure of the Turkish border and the improvement in the central Mediterranean countries, the flow between Libya and Italy has become creating a pressure on the western side, on the Strait region, etc., and that is having a very important impact on Spain. So the migratory pressure is increasing. It is a lot higher than in previous countries. This means an entry of immigrants in Spain, but also the entry of those immigrants in the European Union as a whole. We were saying before that we were having several discussions in several environments, but Spain has a very close relationship with the German government, particularly with the Ministry of Interior and the State Secretary of Security. There's a close relationship with Germany. With Dr. Harvard, we had a meeting recently where that was one of the key worries. The migratory pressure in Germany starts with the difficulty to control the borders in Spain, in Italy, or in Turkey. We therefore have a shared responsibility in this regard. Spain needs to help Germany in that second movement control in Europe, but Germany must help those of us who are an external border. We are part of a team, part of a big community, the European Union, and we therefore must work together if we want to solve those problems. It wouldn't serve of any use if we increased the controls or we work in an isolating way in the territorial scope in Germany, in Austria, in the Czech Republic. That wouldn't serve any purpose if we didn't cooperate with the countries that are on the border of the European Union. So therefore, the responsibility lays in all the European countries. We must manage those borders in the right way. We must identify those people entering our territory, because by doing so, we can control the future movements. And by doing so, we can maintain we can guarantee the rights of those who are already living in any country in the European Union, and we can guarantee the rights of those who aim to be legal European citizens, even if they may start as even if they may arrive as irregular immigrants in the first place. The mass migration at the border of Turkey, or the mass movements in 2016 in the Italian coasts, if we bear all that in mind, we realize that it is a real issue. And it is a real issue that represents a big temptation for it to be used from many different points of view. This has been used from the almost criminal point of view, the most dramatic point of view. Those who are using people as merchandise, as goods, those who base their businesses on putting the life of others at risk, others who want to improve their life conditions. Those who want to improve their situation and they want to invest everything they have, including their lives, to start an adventure that they don't know how it's going to end. These people are being used in a way that means a radical attack to the rules that we've all set up in order to maintain those specific life conditions in a territory like the European Union, which is fully consolidated, but probably the political territory with the highest number of civil rights in the world. The real drama, or the real issue, is that perhaps now those who are using migration for their own benefit have managed for their discourse to prevail over those of us who want migration to follow the same criteria based on logic, on law, the same logics that are applied to all the rest of the citizens. Those who execute those that discourse want to get some political profit. Some of them want to use migration against the non-sensitive attitude of the state. But there are people using it against it. They mobilize large groups of the society against migration, and they highlight it as a threat for our society. And sometimes it is used as a sign. For example, in the state of the Saxon federal state, we can see that the most supported party, those that use the migration as the only electoral element or argument. There is a very dangerous relationship which is migration, Muslim religion, terrorism. This is a cocktail that has been very successful in very many places of the European Union in order to alter the actual discourse of migration. I would like to call on that real discourse on migration. The real drama of somebody not being able to live comfortably with his or her rights guarantees in the place where he or she was born, where his or her family is, where his or her roots are, that is a drama. If somebody feels that is obliged to abandon everything that he or she has, family, memories, in order to start a journey to who knows where, put his or her life at risk, put his life in the hands of absolute criminals, etc., just to look for something that doesn't know exactly what it is, and sometimes to end up living as precariously as he or she used to live in his or her country, that is the actual drama. Therefore, the first line of work is about avoiding that situation in the countries of origin. And we must work on a long-term strategy, because a short or medium-term strategy will never work if we want to solve those origin problems. In order to implement democracy in those countries, in those countries of origin, in Africa and in Asia, we must guarantee the right economic development. Economic development that should also be respectful to its environment, to its nature, which could be itself a source of power or potential economic development. Secondly, I think we must establish safe and legal immigration channels, and we must break and attack the business of people's trafficking, because there is where the key problem lays, and that is the real enemy. The migration policy is not a policy against the migrant, it's not a policy against the person itself. It is against those using the individual in their own benefit, and sometimes with a profitability that is even higher of that drug trafficking or weapons trafficking. And the results of it all are casualties that we've all heard of, or we all know about it, and I am informed on a daily basis on loads of casualties in the Mediterranean. Secondly, we must overcome the current situations. For example, the figures that I gave you at the beginning, these figures represent the actual important problem that we're facing in Spain. This affects the compliance with the legislation, for example, related to the welcoming centers for irregular immigrants, where these people are identified, where certain measures are applied to this person, where this individual is kept. We work with the countries of origin in order to guarantee the rights of these people that have arrived irregularly to Spain, and ultimately the goal is the return of this person to his country of origin with the guarantees that have been set up by everyone. Nowadays, these welcoming centers are totally saturated. And one of the measures that we would like to implement as soon as possible is a new model of these welcoming centers in order to treat and manage those centers. The goal of the safe, the goal of the safe return, if possible, a voluntary return, would be the point where the Spanish government wants to work on, and also the German government wants to work on that idea, that goal. Those people who cannot return safely need a new channel for their integration in the Spanish society. That's something we want to work on as well. But that resource is currently saturated. The Ministry of Employment is making all the possible efforts in order to solve that, but it is incredibly complicated to open the right integration paths. It's particularly a difficult situation in a country like Spain, where we have over 3 million unemployed people. We have a high percentage of people who cross the border and arrive to a country. They're not returned because there are certain difficulties. To a large extent, those people decide to move to other countries. In many cases, Germany is one of those other countries. But Spain, as an entry country, is responsible for the next movements of those individuals within the European Union. Therefore, what we need and what we're aiming for is for that integration to be done successfully. We have in Spain almost 7 million of non-national citizens, that is, migrants. And almost 17%, they almost represent 17% of the Spanish population. But there has been a reasonable integration. There have not been any point of xenophobia. No political party has used the xenophobia as an element, as a campaigning element, and I think that may have to do with the integration of those coming from other countries. I'd also like to add, in agreement with Mr. Tipi, that I don't believe in the positive nor negative integration depending on or related to religion. I think the integration of Muslim people in our country is been as successful as the integration of people with other religions, other creeds. There are about 2 million Muslims in our country. About 40% of them are Spanish. In some cases, they're Spanish, but there are descendants of people who migrated to our country in previous years, and I think there is a positive living together. But there are some radical points, radical groups. I don't think we have 300,000 radical Muslims in our country, really, but we are above, or there are above 100,000 followers of radical Islamic rights. We have been the target of some terrorist attacks in our country, the last one in Barcelona in August. We are analyzing the environment of those people who decided to attack in Barcelona, and it is incredibly surprising how absurd the situation is, how absurd the attack was. All those people had an employment. All of them were integrated. Pretty much all of them were second-generation migrants in our country, although most of them had been born in Morocco, with a very high integration within their community and their respect by their community, and no particular criminal report from any other citizen related to the religious practice. So as we said before, there is somebody who is using the element of migration in their own benefit. That includes terrorism. That includes those who want to manipulate people who, due to several reasons, fall into that trap, and they become either an economic type of good or in some kind of political argument, negative argument, obviously, just to be used against the society, or perhaps to take on their specific situation for their own electoral benefit, etc. And there are also people who use it as a merchandise for the most absurd and fanatic terrorism, which is what we saw in the attacks in Barcelona and Cambrils. It is also what happened in 2004 in a torture station, and it is also what we are constantly seeing in the UK, in Germany, in France, in all those countries where they are suffering from terrorist attacks. So I think nowadays, integration and the management of living together within the European space is the key subject on the table. I think there is a positive will to tackle this situation in order to overcome it, but I think we must also be alert, and we shouldn't allow anybody to use the pain of so many people in a twisted way. A lot of people are suffering, a lot of countries are suffering, and this is not acceptable. And in order to conclude, I'd like to say thank you to Casa Árabe. I consider them my friends. The other headquarters of Casa Árabe is in Cordoba, and I was the mayor of Cordoba time ago, and therefore it's been a pleasure for me to meet its director, whom I also met in Hamburg some time ago. So thank you very much. I hope this meeting is useful for everyone, and I hope the reflections are useful and enriching for everyone. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Secretario de Estado.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State, for your presentation and for chairing this opening session. And now the Secretary of State must go because he has other commitments, and therefore excuse myself for a few minutes.
Porque yo tengo el gran placer de presentarles a señora Ana Terrón,
because we are now going to listen to Ana Terrón. She is a specialist for integration in companies at an international and European level. She manages diversity, asylum, and international mobility.
Señora Terrón ha sido secretaria de Estado de Inmigración.
She was Secretary of State for Immigration till the year 2011. Has also worked in Catalonia. She has been a member of the European Parliament and was a member of the Commission for Civil Liberties in the European Parliament. And now she is going to give us the first presentation and is going to talk about migration and the management of diversity in our societies. Thank you very much for having accepted the invitation, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentation. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and for the work the Foundation is doing. And thank you to Casa Árabe. I would like to go back to an impression that has been left by this very interesting opening session. I think it is well worth studying two things: the relationship between the immigration and the diversity and the management of the diversity in our societies. Then I'd like to have a look at the model of migration that is in place, how it can be improved, and on the other hand, I would also like to ask myself whether what we are dealing with nowadays goes beyond the consequences of the immigration. Some figures have already been presented, but I would like to insist that in our country there is a certain percentage of immigration. The percentage is around 5 million something immigrants in Spain, so foreigners in Spain who have their residency in our country. Although it is true that our model is based on certain nationalities and which is very generous with regard to certain nationalities. So these figures, I would like to now put them into the context of the migration internationally. 240 million migrants, 60 million of which are refugees. But we cannot forget that this is 3% of the world population. In other words, 97% of the inhabitants of this planet live where their home is, where previous generations have decided to live. So migration is a very important phenomenon, but we have to not lose sight of the context. What is true is that this phenomenon nowadays takes place against the backdrop of a very high degree of mobility of human beings, but this mobility has nothing to do with migration. Let's think of the numbers of tourists that arrive in Spain, for example, and the number of people that cross borders every day. So mobility is a much larger phenomenon than the migration phenomenon. And we also live within a global world in which terms like inside, outside borders are concepts that become more and more virtual. Of course, on the other hand, there are realities, there are conflicts, there are wars in the zone. There is radical Islam, which of course is also now as mobile as any other element of our life. I think that we have to state something that seems obvious. We have to define what is migration, what is a migrant, and what can migration policy do with regard to migration. There are very orthodox definitions. The migrant is a person that leaves its place of origin in order to establish himself in another place, hoping for a better life. And this includes the 60 million refugees out of the 240 million migrants. The border is the place that these people have to cross together with millions of other people, and the immigration policy is the policy that defines which are the requirements that a person has to fulfill in order to be allowed to cross that border and to get a residency in the country of arrival. And then, of course, the immigration policy is the policy designed to eliminate the barriers that these legal immigrants find when they try to establish themselves in another country. So the immigration policy is a policy that should help migrants to fulfill their life project in the country of arrival. Now, nowadays, there is an important problem with the model of immigration policy, because this model that I've just designed nowadays, to put it mildly, is a model that has failed. And the proof is that practically in the whole of the European Union, this model is based on these immigrants finding a job. So there is a list of people who apply for these working permits, and if we look at this list, well, this is a list that has very little in common. So this normally is a list of jobs that are not desired by the national population. So a large number of first residency permits has to do with this. So all of these factors prove that the system that is in place doesn't work and gives rise to illegal residencies, to illegal work. So this weight of immigration on our public policy is a very heavy weight. And in Europe, we are now witnessing a situation where we talk about legal immigration as part of the immigration, of the real immigration. When I hear this, I always ask myself, what would we think of our other public policy models, for example, trade, or environmental policies, if we very naturally were to say, well, there is a certain percentage of our trade policies that is legal, and a certain percentage of our trade policies that's illegal, or our environmental policy. We would certainly not accept that as normal. But when we talk about immigration policy, we do accept this as part of a certain normality here in Europe, in all our countries. So the so-called legal migration and the illegal migration. So that is the state of the migration policy right now. And this creates a very strong tension in the European Union, because this model is a model that was conceived in its days in relationship with the freedom of movement in the European Union. And this freedom of movement, freedom of trade, and so on, is one of the pillars of the European Union. And yet, nowadays, this freedom of movement can't be granted anymore. Among many of our European countries, it is being questioned, even in the Schengen area, or in Malmö, for example, closure of borders partially. So these are realities. So the border, the frontier, is now an essential part of the whole immigration system, and plays a very important role also from a symbolic point of view. The border, the frontier, is what separates us from others. So there is now, and there is also the border is something that protects us. And migration policy often is also associated to a lack of security. We have a feeling that there is a certain lack of security in this post-crisis period that we live in. There are many citizens in our societies who feel that their economic security is not granted, that it is not obvious what they can count on with regard to their future. And very often, this lack of economic security and prosperity is also associated to the phenomenon of migration, of illegal migration, illegal employments, and lack of control.
La migración interactúa de una forma fuerte con las dinámicas políticas.
So there is this mix of factors that interfere with each other's migration, which is perceived as an immigration without control, and the perception of the immigrants as the others who are different from us. So if we then analyze our public policies, and if we try to assess their efficiency with regard to the protection of the borders and the guarantee of security and safety, both of the immigrants and of the national citizens, and if we include all this, also a certain contribution to the safety globally, well, if we assess these policies and their efficiency, we have to admit that they are anything but ideal. They tell me that I have to come to the end. Well, then I'll jump forward, and we'll now talk about immigration of the otherness, and would like to talk about the Muslim immigrants as a separate aspect of the immigration policy. This otherness, which we build when we think and talk about immigrants for the reasons I have just explained, has turned more and more towards the Muslim immigrant and Islam as a problem and identified as a problem clearly. So here we have, and then there is a direct relationship with security aspects. There is, on the other hand, there is the hope or the wish for another immigration model that permits social inclusion. I prefer that to integration, social inclusion of the Muslim immigrants. And this is an idea I would like to leave with you. We should try to establish a difference between diversity and foreigners, to de-foreignize, to create a new word, the diversity. We have certain requirements that immigrants in our societies have to fulfill. They are well defined, but once they fulfill them, then there is then the next phase, and that is that a society that has spent decades receiving foreigners cannot consider them foreigners anymore. They are just part of a culturally diverse society, which is the Spanish society of nowadays. We have very often talked about second generations of immigrants, and after what happened in Barcelona and the analysis of the perpetrators of that attack, and it is important that we analyze that in detail, but there we have a photograph of a few of these elements. We've been talking about people from other countries who've been living with us, where the problem is not the integration of the second generation of immigrants, because all the indicators we have about this integration are positive. These young people close to Barcelona were indicated according to those indicators, but the problem here was more the relationship between the first and second generation. Because these young people tell us that the more we study, the more included we are in the arrival societies, more we create a distance between us and our parents, between the first generation. And this is another interesting aspect right now. I'm not saying that this is the cause of what's happening, but there is a correlation between these phenomena and this generation, between first and second generation. Somehow the radical Islam has to be analyzed with this in mind, and particularly when it comes to violent radicalization, because often this has been due to a certain disruption in their natural relationships. And finally, what is it I would like to leave with you? Well, we have to review our immigration model. We need to improve the legal immigration pathways, and the illegality has to be eradicated from our model. We have to define what we expect immigration to achieve, and finally we have to understand that we live in a diverse company, and that no matter how efficient an immigration policy is, we cannot get away from the fact that diversity in our society is a reality and is here to stay, and we have to adapt to it. There is one chapter, well, I have forgotten to mention, but I think it's important. In this global world, we've talked about the relationship between the countries of origin and the arrival countries is a relationship that has to be permanent. If I have claimed that diversity should not be identified with different nationalities, but on the other hand, we cannot pretend that these different nationalities, although we live together in harmony, will always exist. And I think we have made a few mistakes the relationships between the European countries and the countries of origin where is a relationship that has to be revisited. And then in countries where the societies are now transnational, the relationships with the countries of origin of these other nationalities that live together in the society has to be a special one, because cooperating with the countries of origin, well, the harmony in the societies of arrival can be achieved or can be facilitated. And then we also have to have a look at other subgroups in our societies, not necessarily based on nationalities. Thank you very much.